Welcome back to Footnotes and Folly. I am Pembroke and this is part 10. Herodotus now opens the priest's great book of Kings, 330 of them, he is told, stretching back further than any Greek dared imagine. We meet men who dammed the river and raised Memphis from a marsh, the avenging Queen Euterpe, and above all Sesostris, the conqueror who is said to have subdued half the world, carved his pillars from Asia to Thrace, and parcelled out the soil of Egypt, inventing, Herodotus thinks, the science of geometry. And then the jewel of the book, the tale of Proteus, and the astonishing argument that Helen and her stolen treasure spent the whole Trojan War not in Troy at all, but here, in Egypt. Let us continue.
Up to this point, what I have said has been supported by my own observation, judgment, and inquiry. From this point onward, I am going to tell the history of Egypt according to what I heard, with something also added from what I have myself seen. The priest said that men, who first became king of Egypt, banked off the site of Memphis from the river. Formerly the whole stream of the river flowed along beside the sandy mountain range on the Libyan side, but men, by embankments, formed the bend of the river which lies to the south about 100 furlongs above Memphis. In this way he dried up the old stream, and directed the river so that it flowed in the middle between the mountains. Even now this bend of the Nile is kept under very careful watch by the Persians, so that it may continue to flow in the channel to which it is confined, and the bank is repaired every year. For if the river were to break through and overflow in this direction, Memphis would be in danger of being overwhelmed by flood. When this meant the first king had made dry land of the part that had been dammed off, he founded there the city now called Memphis, for Memphis also lies in the narrow part of Egypt. Outside the city he dug a lake around it on the north and west, communicating with the river, while the eastern side is barred by the Nile itself. Then secondly, he established in the city the temple of Hephaestus, a great work and very worthy of mention. After this man, the priests read out to me from a papyrus roll the names of other kings, 330 in number. In all these generations of men, 18 were Ethiopians, 1 was a woman, a native Egyptian, and the rest were men of Egyptian race. The name of the woman who reigned was the same as that of the Babylonian queen, namely Nitocris. They said that she wished to take vengeance for her brother, whom the Egyptians had slain while he was their king, and whose kingdom they had then given to her after killing him. Desiring to avenge him, she destroyed many of the Egyptians by craft. She caused a very large underground chamber to be built, and pretending that she would inaugurate it, while in her mind she had other plans, she invited those Egyptians whom she knew to have had the greatest part in the murder and gave a great banquet. While they were feasting, she let the river in upon them through a large hidden conduit. About her they told no more than this, except that when this had been accomplished, she threw herself into a room full of embers in order to escape vengeance. As for the other kings, they could tell me of no great works produced by them, and they said that they had no renown except only the last of them, Morris. He, they said, produced as a memorial of himself the gateway of the temple of Hephaestus that faces toward the north wind. He also dug a lake, about which I shall later set forth how many furlongs in circuit it has, and in it he built pyramids of the size I shall mention at the same time when I speak of the lake itself. He, they said, produced these works, but none of the others produced any. Therefore, passing these by, I shall mention the king who came after them, whose name was Sesostris. He, the priest said, first set out with warships from the Arabian Gulf and subdued those who lived along the shores of the Erythraean Sea, until as he sailed he came to a sea that could no longer be navigated because of shoals. Then, after returning to Egypt, according to the priest's report, he took a great army and marched over the continent, subduing every nation that stood in his way. Those nations whom he found valiant and fighting desperately for their freedom, he set up pillars in their lands with inscriptions, telling his own name and the name of his country, and how he had subdued them by his power. But in the cities he took without fighting or with ease, he inscribed on their pillars words of the same kind as he did for the nations that had shown courage, and in addition he drew on them the hidden parts of a woman, wishing by this to signify that the people were cowardly and effeminate. Acting in this way, he traversed the continent until at last he crossed from Asia into Europe and subdued the Scythians and the Thracians. These, in my opinion, were the farthest peoples to which the Egyptian army came, for in their country the pillars are found to have been set up, while in the land beyond this they are no longer found. From this point he turned and began to go back. When he came to the river Phasis, I cannot say for certain what happened then, whether King Sesostris himself separated off a certain part of his army and left the men there as settlers in the land, or whether some of his soldiers were wearied by his distant marches and remained by the river Phasis. The people of Colchis are evidently Egyptian, and I perceived this myself before I heard it from others. When I came to consider the matter, I asked both peoples about it. The Colchians remembered the Egyptians more than the Egyptians remembered the Colchians, but the Egyptians said they believed the Colchians were a portion of the army of Sesostris. I conjectured this myself not only because they are dark-skinned and have curly hair, for this by itself amounts to nothing, since there are other races that are so, but even more because the Colchians, Egyptians, and Ethiopians alone of all human races have practiced circumcision from the beginning. The Phoenicians and the Syrians who live in Palestine admit that they learned it from the Egyptians. The Syrians around the river Thermodon and the river Parthenios, and the Macronians, who are their neighbors, say they learned it recently from the Colchians. These are the only races of men who practice circumcision, and they evidently practice it in the same manner as the Egyptians. As for the Egyptians themselves and the Ethiopians, I cannot say which learned it from the other, for it is undoubtedly a very ancient custom. But that the other nations learned it through intercourse with the Egyptians is strongly proved to me, among other things, by this: those Phoenicians who have intercourse with Hellas cease to follow the Egyptian example in this matter, and do not circumcise their children. Now let me tell another thing about the Colchians to show how they resemble the Egyptians. They alone work flax in the same fashion as the Egyptians, and the two nations are alike in their whole manner of life and also in their language. The linen of Colchis is called sardonic by the Hellenes, while that from Egypt is called Egyptian. Pillars which Sesostris of Egypt set up in the various countries are for the most part no longer to be seen standing. But in Syria, Palestine, I myself saw them still existing, with the inscription I have mentioned in the emblem. Moreover, in Ionia, there are two figures of this man carved on rocks, one on the road by which one goes from the land of Ephesus to Phocaea, and the other on the road from Sardis to Smyrna. In each place there is a figure of a man cut in the rock, 4 cubits and a span high, holding a spear in his right hand, and a bow and arrows in his left. The rest of his equipment is similar, for it is both Egyptian and Ethiopian. From one shoulder to the other, across the breast, runs an inscription carved in sacred Egyptian characters, saying, "This land with my shoulders I won for myself." But who he is and where he comes from, he does not declare in these places, though he has declared this elsewhere. Some of those who have seen these carvings suppose that the figure is Memnon, but in this they are very far from the truth. As this Egyptian Sesostris was returning and bringing back many men from the nations whose lands he had subdued, the priest said that when he came to Daphne in the district of Pelusium on his way home, his brother, to whom Sesostris had entrusted the charge of Egypt, invited him and his sons with him to a feast. Then the brother piled brushwood around the house and set it on fire. When Sesostris discovered this, he immediately took counsel with his wife, for they said he was bringing his wife with him also. She advised him to lay 2 of his sons, out of 6, upon the burning mass and so make a bridge over it, so that they could pass over their bodies and escape. Sesostris did this, they said, and 2 of his sons were burned to death in this way, while the rest escaped safely with their father. After Sesostris returned to Egypt and took vengeance on his brother, he used the multitude he had brought back from the subdued nations in the following way. These were the men who drew the stones, very great in size, that were brought in this king's reign to the temple of Hephaestus. They were also compelled to dig all the channels that now exist in Egypt. In this way, though they had no such intention, they caused Egypt, which before had all been fit for riding and driving, to be no longer fit for this from then on. From that time forward, Egypt, though it is flat land, has become entirely unfit for riding and driving, and the cause has been these channels, which are many and run in all directions. The reason why the king cut up the land was this: those Egyptians whose cities were not on the river but in the middle of the country lacked water when the river withdrew from them, and found their drink brackish, because they got it from wells. For this reason Egypt was cut up. They said also that this king distributed the land to all the Egyptians, giving each man an equal square portion, and from this he made his revenue, having appointed them to pay a certain rent each year. If the river took away anything from any man's portion, the man would come to the king and report what had happened, and the king would send men to examine and find out by measurement how much smaller the piece of land had become, so that in the future the man might pay less in proportion to the rent appointed. I think that in this way the art of geometry was discovered and afterward came into Hellas also. As for the sundial, the gnomon, and the 12 divisions of the day, the Hellenes learned them from the Babylonians. Sesostris alone of all the Egyptian kings also ruled over Ethiopia. He left memorials of himself in front of the temple of Hephaestus, 2 stone statues of 30 cubits each, representing himself and his wife, and others of 20 cubits each representing his 4 sons. Long afterward the priest of Hephaestus refused to allow Darius the Persian to set up a statue of himself in front of them, saying that Darius had not done deeds equal to those done by Sesostris the Egyptian. Sesostris had subdued other nations, not fewer than Darius, and also the Scythians, but Darius had not been able to conquer the Scythians. Therefore it was not just for him to set up a statue in front of those dedicated by Sesostris unless he surpassed him in his deeds. This speech, they say, Darius took in good part. After Sesostris ended his life, they told me, his son Pheros inherited the kingdom. He made no military expedition, and it happened that he became blind because of the following accident. When the river came down in flood, rising to a height of 18 cubits, higher than ever before that time, and had gone over the fields, a wind fell upon it, and the river was stirred up with waves. This king, they say, moved by presumptuous folly, took a spear and threw it into the middle of the eddies of the stream. Immediately after this he suffered a disease of the eyes, and was made blind by it. For 10 years he remained blind. In the 11th year an oracle came to him from the city of Buto, saying that the time of his punishment had expired, and that he would see again if he washed his eyes with the water of a woman who had kept company only with her own husband, and had known no other men. First he made trial of his own wife, then, as he remained blind, he went on to test all the women in turn. When at last he recovered his sight, he gathered together all the women he had tested, except the one by whose means he had regained his sight, into one city, which is now named Erythrabolos. Having gathered them there, he burned them all, together with the city itself. But the woman by whose means he had regained his sight he took as his own wife. After escaping from the disease of his eyes, he dedicated offerings at each of the temples of renown. Especially, to mention only what is most worthy of note, he dedicated at the temple of the sun works worth seeing: 2 stone obelisks, each made from a single block, each measuring 100 cubits in length and 8 cubits in breadth. After him, they said, a man of Memphis succeeded to the throne, whose name in the tongue of the Hellenes was Proteus. There is now at Memphis a sacred enclosure for him, very fair and well ordered, lying on the side of the temple of Hephaestus that faces the north wind. Around this enclosure live Phoenicians of Tyre, and this whole region is called the camp of the Tyrians. Within the enclosure of Proteus, there is a temple called the Temple of the Foreign Aphrodite. I conjecture this temple to be one of Helen, the daughter of Tyndarus, not only because I have heard the tale that Helen lived with Proteus, but especially because it is called by the name Foreign Aphrodite. None of the other temples of Aphrodite has the word foreign added to its name. When I inquired, the priest told me that the matters concerning Helen happened in this way. Alexander, after carrying off Helen, was sailing away from Sparta to his own land. When he came to the Aegean Sea, contrary winds drove him from his course to the Sea of Egypt. After that, since the blasts did not cease, he came to Egypt itself, and in Egypt to what is now called the Canopic mouth of the Nile, and to Tarichae. On the shore there was, as there still is now, a temple of Herodotus. If any man's slave takes refuge there, and has the sacred marks set upon him, giving himself over to the god, it is not lawful to lay hands on him. This custom has continued unchanged from the beginning down to my own time. Accordingly, Alexander's attendants, having heard of the custom concerning the temple, ran away from him. Sitting down as suppliants of the god, they accused Alexander, because they wished to harm him, telling the whole story of Helen and of the wrong done to Menelaus. They made this accusation not only to the priests, but also to the warden of this river mouth, whose name was Thonis. There has come a stranger, a Teucrian by race, who has done an unholy deed in Hellas. He has deceived the wife of his own host, and he has come here bringing this woman herself, and very much wealth, having been driven by winds out of his way to your land. Shall we allow him to sail away unharmed, or shall we first take from him what he brought with him? Seize this man, whoever he may be, who has acted impiously toward his own host, and bring him into my presence, so that I may know what he will find to say. When Thonis heard this reply, he seized Alexander and detained his ships. After that he brought the man himself up to Memphis, and with him Helen, the wealth he had, and also the suppliants. When all had been brought there, Proteus began to ask Alexander who he was, and from where he was sailing. Alexander recounted his descent, told the name of his native land, and also related the course of his voyage, and where he was sailing from. After this Proteus asked him where he had taken Helen from. When Alexander wandered in his account, and did not speak the truth, those who had become suppliants convicted him of falsehood, relating in full the whole story of the wrong done. If I did not count it a matter of great importance, not to kill any strangers who, driven from their course by winds, have come to my land up to this time, I would have taken vengeance on you on behalf of the man of Hellas. You most base of men, after receiving hospitality from him, committed against him a most impious deed. You went into the wife of your own host, and even this was not enough for you, but you stirred her with desire and carried her off like a thief. Nor was even this by itself enough for you, but you have come here with plunder taken from the house of your host. Now therefore depart, since I have counted it of great importance not to be a killer of strangers. This woman, and the wealth you have I will not allow you to carry away, but I shall keep them safe for the Hellene who is your host until he comes himself and wishes to carry them home. To you and your fellow voyagers I proclaim that you must depart from your anchorage within 3 days and go from my land to some other place. If not, you will be treated as enemies. The priest said this was how Helen came to Proteus. I suppose that Homer also had heard this story, but since it was not so suitable for the composition of his poem as the other story which he followed, he finally dismissed it, while making clear at the same time that he knew the story too. From the way he described the wanderings of Alexander in the Iliad, and nowhere else retracted what he had said, it is clear that when Alexander brought Helen he was carried off course, wandered to various lands, and came, among other places, to Sidon in Phoenicia. The poet mentions this in the prowess of Diomed, in verses saying that Helen had many colored robes, works of Sidonian women, whom godlike Alexander himself had carried from Sidon when he sailed over the broad sea path bringing home Helen, daughter of a noble father. In the Odyssey also he mentions it in verses saying that the daughter of Zeus had such skillfully made drugs, good ones, which Polydamna, the wife of Thon, had given her in Egypt, the land where the rich meadow produces more drugs than any other land, many good mixed with many evil. So too Menelaus says to Telemachus that the gods still detained him in Egypt when he wished to come back, keeping him from voyaging home, because he had not performed the sacrifice that was due. In these lines Homer makes clear that he knew of Alexander's wandering to Egypt, for Syria borders Egypt, and the Phoenicians, among whom Sidon belongs, live in Syria. By these lines, and by this passage, it is also most clearly shown that the Cyprian epic was not written by Homer, but by some other man. In that poem it is said that on the third day after leaving Sparta, Alexander came to Ilion bringing Helen with him, having had a gently blowing wind and a smooth sea, whereas in the Iliad it says that he wandered from his course when he brought her. Let us now leave Homer and the Cyprian epic. But this I will say, I asked the priests whether the story told by the Hellenes about what happened at Ilion is only an idle tale. They answered as follows, saying that they had their knowledge from inquiries made of Menelaus himself. After the rape of Helen, they said, a great army of Hellenes came to the Teucrian land to help Menelaus. When the army had come ashore from the ships and pitched its camp there, they sent messengers to Ilion, with Menelaus himself also going with them. When these messengers entered within the wall, they demanded back Helen and the wealth that Alexander had stolen from Menelaus and carried away, and they also demanded satisfaction for the wrongs done. The Teucrians told the same story then and afterward, both with oath and without oath, that indeed and in truth they did not have Helen or the wealth being demanded, but that both were in Egypt, and that they could not justly be forced to give satisfaction for what Proteus, king of Egypt, had. The Hellenes, however, thought they were being mocked by them, and besieged the city until at last they took it. When they had taken the wall and did not find Helen, but heard the same story as before, they then believed the former account and sent Menelaus himself to Proteus. Menelaus came to Egypt, sailed up to Memphis, and told the truth of these matters. He not only found great hospitality, but also received Helen unharmed and all his own wealth besides. Yet after being treated in this way, Menelaus showed himself ungrateful to the Egyptians. When he set out to sail away, contrary winds held him back, and as this state of things continued for a long time, he devised an impious deed. He took 2 children of natives and sacrificed them. After this became known, he was hated, and being pursued, he escaped and got away in his ships to Libya. Where else he went after this the Egyptians could not tell. Of these things they said they discovered part by inquiry, and the rest, namely what happened in their own land, they related from sure and certain knowledge. Thus the priests of the Egyptians told me. I myself also agree with the story told about Helen, adding this consideration. If Helen had been in Ilion, she would have been given back to the Hellenes, whether Alexander consented or not. Surely Priam was not so mad, nor were the others of his house, that they wished to risk ruin for themselves, their children, and their city merely so that Alexander might have Helen as his wife. Even if during the first part of the time they had been so inclined, yet when many other Trojans were losing their lives whenever they fought with the Hellenes, and when always 2 or 3 or even more of Priam's own sons were slain whenever a battle took place, if one may trust the epic poets at all, then, when things were turning out this way, I think that even if Priam himself had Helen as his wife, he would have given her back to the Achaeans, if by doing so he could be freed from the evils oppressing him. Nor was the kingdom going to pass next to Alexander, so that the government would be in his hands when Priam was old. Hector, who was both older and more of a man than Alexander, would have received it after Priam's death, and it was not fitting for him to allow his brother to continue in his wrongdoing, when great evils were happening because of him both to Hector personally and to the Trojans in general. In truth, however, they lacked the power to give Helen back, and the Hellenes did not believe them, though they were speaking the truth. As I declare my opinion, the divine power intended to cause them utterly to perish, and so to make it clear to human beings that for great wrongs great punishments also come from the gods. Thus I have delivered my opinion concerning these matters.
And we will stop there, with Herodotus having calmly informed Homer that he got the whole story wrong, that Troy was besieged for 10 years over a woman the Trojans could not have handed back, because she was safe in Egypt the entire time. If true, it is one of the great literary heresies. Next time, in part 11, the most outrageous kings of all, a master thief who robs a royal treasury and lives to marry the princess, and the tyrant who shut every temple in Egypt to build the Great Pyramid. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.